Exercise 12. You will hear part of a lecture in a chemistry class. The class has been focusing on hydrocarbon compounds. We've been considering various useful hydrocarbon compounds, and today we're going to look at one of the most useful of all of these. That's right, I'm talking about coal. There probably wouldn't have been an industrial revolution in the 18th century without coal. Even today, life would be very different if we didn't have coal. So, where does coal come from? Well, imagine what the Earth was like, say, 300 million years ago, during the Carboniferous period. Much of the land was covered with luxuriant vegetation, especially ferns big as trees. Eventually, these plants died and were submerged in the waters of swamps, where they gradually decomposed. And we've seen what happens when plants decompose. The vegetable matter loses oxygen and hydrogen atoms, leaving a deposit with a high percentage of carbon. In this way, peat bogs were formed. Then, as time went on, layers of sand and mud settled from the water over the peat bogs. These deposits grew thicker and thicker, and the pressure increased, and the deposits were compressed and hardened. And so you have coal. All grades of coal have uses. Lignite, the lowest grade of coal, is often burned in furnaces for heat. Most bituminous coal, which has a higher carbon content, is used by utility companies to produce electricity. Anthracite, which has the highest carbon content, is often distilled to produce coke. Coke is almost pure carbon and is used in the manufacture of steel. And coal tar, one of the byproducts of producing coke, is used to make many different types of plastic. Number 1. The lecturer discusses the steps involved in the creation of coal. Summarize this process by putting the events in the proper order. Number 2. Match the form of coal with the type of industry which primarily uses it. This is part of a discussion in an accounting seminar. The seminar is talking about some of the basic principles of accounting.
Hello, everyone. As you can see from our course syllabus, our topic today is something called GAAP. Anyone have any idea what we mean by that acronym, GAAP? Yes, Susan.
I think it means Generally Accepted Accounting Practices.
Almost right. Anyone else? Michael?
Generally Accepted Accounting Principles, I think.
Bingo! You got it. Today we're going to talk about 3 of the most important of these principles. First, the business entity principle. Who could explain that principle? Elaine?
It means that a business has to keep its accounts separate from its owner's account. Is that right?
Indeed it is, Elaine. It means an owner's assets and liabilities are not the same as his or her business's assets and liabilities. Now, another principle we're going to consider today is the cost principle. Michael, what do you think that might be?
I don't know, Professor. Does it mean that costs always have to be recorded in the books?
Well, not just that they have to be recorded, but that they have to be recorded at the price at which they were originally purchased, not at today's market value. Let's say you bought 10 computers 5 years ago for $1,000 each, and that today they are worth half that. This principle says that you have to keep them on your books as being worth $1,000. We'll talk more about this later, but first I want to mention the last principle we'll consider today, which is the matching principle. Anyone know what that is? Susan?
No idea, Professor.
Anyone else? No? Well, this principle simply states that a firm has to record any expenses it incurs while selling goods or services in the period when the sale was made. If you own a used car lot, and your books say you sold a car in December, you have to record the expense of the salesperson's December salary along with that sale. Okay, we're going to go back and talk about all these principles in more detail. But before we do that, does anyone have any questions?
Number 3. Match the accounting principle with the appropriate description of it. You will hear part of a guest lecture given in a class in agronomy. The lecture focuses on locally grown crops.
Hello, I'm Floyd Haney. I'm the U.S. Department of Agriculture's county agent here in Harrison County. Professor McKenzie asked me to talk to you about the agricultural situation in Harrison County today. Now, you probably already know that our main crop is traditionally wheat, followed by corn. Wheat is still the most important, but did you realize that in the last few years, soybeans have become considerably more important economically than corn? I'll bet that's a surprise for most of you. Then, of course, in the southern part of the county, there are a number of organic fruit farms, mostly growing apples and pears, but so far these are not nearly as important to our county economically as any of the 3 crops I mentioned. So, let's talk about our top crop, which is wheat, as I said. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, there are 7 types of wheat, depending on their texture and color. You'll find 3 or 4 of those growing here in Harrison County. You get a lot of durum wheat here, which is mainly used for making pasta, spaghetti, macaroni, and so on. Then there's soft white wheat, which is generally purchased by companies that make breakfast cereals. And, of course, you have hard red wheat, which makes wonderful bread flour.
Number 4. The lecturer mentions 4 types of crops that are grown in Harrison County. Rank these 4 crops in their order of economic importance, beginning with the most important. Number 5. Match the type of wheat with the product that is most often made from it. This is a part of a discussion in a history class. The class has been focusing on the history of exploration.
Okay, we're going to go on with our discussion of explorers and exploration. Today we're talking about 20th century explorers. You know, usually when we talk about explorers in the 20th century, we think of space explorers walking on the moon. But in the early part of the century, the most important sphere of discovery was Antarctica. Tell me, has anyone here ever read anything about the early exploration of Antarctica?
When I was in high school, I read a book by Admiral Byrd called Alone, about the winter he spent in a shelter in Antarctica by himself.
Yes, that's a fascinating book.
I was amazed at how he could survive in that terrible, cold, dark shelter all winter by himself.
Professor Smith, was Byrd the first person to get to the South Pole?
No. He was the first person to fly over the South Pole in 1929, but not the first person to go there on foot. In 1929, he also established the first large-scale camp in Antarctica. Since he was from the United States, he named it Little America.
So, who was the first to the South Pole then?
That's an interesting question. About 20 years before Byrd's flight, there was something of a race to get to the South Pole by foot. It was a little like the space race in the 50s and 60s. The first explorer to get near the South Pole was a British explorer named Shackleton. That was in 1909. He was less than 100 miles from the pole when he had to turn around.
Why did he turn back when he was so close?
Well, he was running low on supplies, and as so often happens in Antarctica, the weather turned bad. Then, in 1911, 2 expeditions headed for the pole. The first one to leave was under the Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen. The other was under another British explorer, Robert Scott.
Don't keep us in suspense. Who won?
Amundsen's party reached the pole in December of 1911. Scott's party got there about a month later, in January of 1912.
Oh, the people in Scott's party must have been terribly disappointed.
Yes, apparently they were very discouraged, and the return trip to their base turned into a nightmare. They suffered setback after setback. Then, of course, terrible storms came up, and none of them survived the trip.
Number 6. The professor discusses some of the history of Antarctic exploration. Summarize this history by putting these expeditions in the order in which they began. Number 7. Match these Antarctic explorers with the countries from which they came. Listen to a lecture in a musical acoustics class about decibel levels. Sound levels below about 40 decibels are not very useful in music. They require that background noise, such as audience movement or ventilating systems, be even lower, and that often is not the case. Levels over about 100 are not only unpleasantly loud, but also can be damaging to the ear. As a matter of fact, lately I've been doing a little research on my own on decibel levels that I want to share with you. Last week, I went to an amplified rock concert by a band called The Creatures. At least, I think that's what they were called, and I took a sound level meter with me. I measured sound levels as high as 115 decibels from my seat. Oh, and I can vouch for the fact that this level of sound is painfully loud. A couple of nights later, I measured the sound levels at a concert by the Metropolitan Philharmonic Symphony. Although a full orchestra is theoretically capable of producing sounds at a much higher level, I didn't record any sounds from my seat above 90 decibels. Most of the sound levels were much lower. And when the first violinist performed a solo, the highest level I detected was only around 60 decibels. Number 8. Match the performance with its maximum decibel level.